For Lily, this shift felt like being left behind, as though her role in the family had suddenly become insignificant. As Tommy grew older, it became evident that Sarah's obsession with him only deepened. Lily's needs, emotional, physical, and even academic, were consistently overlooked. There was no one to notice when she came home with a scraped knee from a fall at school, no one to ask about her day when she returned from class, and certainly no one to celebrate her small victories or offer comfort for her disappointments. Instead, Tommy's tantrums were the ones that captured Sarah's attention, and Tommy's achievements, however small, were the ones that were celebrated. It seemed as though Lily's existence had faded into the background, unnoticed and unimportant. In many ways, Tommy was pampered in a way Lily had never been. His every whim was catered to, and there was no limit to what Sarah would do for him. Whether it was buying him new toys, allowing him to skip chores, or ensuring that his every need was met immediately, Tommy was shielded from the realities of responsibility. Sarah's devotion to Tommy knew no bounds, but Lily, as much as she tried, could not win her mother's affection. No matter how hard she worked in school or tried to be a model daughter, it was never enough. Lily often wondered why she couldn't be the one who received her mother's attention and care. Why was Tommy's every need met, while hers went unnoticed? At the dinner table, this inequality became increasingly apparent. While Sarah would patiently feed Tommy, making sure he ate every bite, Lily was left to fend for herself. It wasn't just about the food. There was a growing sense that Lily's presence wasn't valued in the same way. As Sarah made excuses for Tommy's behavior, dismissing any concerns or criticisms, Lily began to feel more and more invisible. Her own desires, simple requests like asking for help with homework or hoping for a little praise for her achievements, were constantly dismissed or ignored. If she did manage to get her mother's attention, it was fleeting, and often followed by a sharp reminder that Tommy needed her more. One day, while Sarah was busy tending to Tommy's latest request for a toy, Lily quietly sat at the kitchen table, her homework scattered in front of her. She watched as her mother, once so attentive and loving, now seemed so distant. She wanted to cry out, to ask for her mother's attention, but she didn't know how. It was as if the mother she had once known, the one who held her hand, who comforted her when she had bad dreams, was no longer there. The void left by her father's death had been filled by Sarah's obsession with Tommy, and Lily had become an afterthought in the process. Lily's growing sense of neglect wasn't lost on Richard, her stepfather. He had been a quiet observer of the family dynamics since he moved into their home. Though he loved Tommy, he could see how Sarah's behavior was affecting Lily. Richard, always patient and understanding, tried to make Lily feel heard. He would sit down with her in the evenings, helping her with her math homework or listening to her talk about her day. He made a point to attend her karate practices, cheering her on like any father would. But no matter how much attention Richard gave her, it didn't seem to fill the emotional gap left by her mother's neglect. The more Richard tried to step in, the more Sarah's defensiveness grew. When Richard would point out that Tommy needed to be given more independence, that he should learn to do things for himself, Sarah would bristle, her maternal instinct kicking in. She would argue that Tommy wasn't ready for such responsibility, that he was too young and needed her more than ever. But Richard, though well-meaning, was often met with a wall of resistance. Sarah's love for Tommy had become possessive, and her need to protect him from even the smallest hardship had clouded her judgment. Lily, meanwhile, was left to navigate the growing rift between her mother and Richard, feeling like an outsider in her own home. The disparity between the way Lily was treated and the way Tommy was indulged continued to grow. Tommy never had to clean his room, and if he made a mess, Lily was the one who was asked to clean up after him. Sarah didn't see this as a problem. She saw it as her duty as a mother to cater to Tommy's every need. Lily, on the other hand, was expected to take on the role of caretaker, of the responsible child who could help out whenever needed. Richard noticed this imbalance and voiced his concern, but Sarah responded with an emotional outburst, accusing him of favoring Lily over Tommy. It was clear that Sarah's attachment to Tommy had become so consuming that she could no longer see the harm it was causing. The constant reinforcement of Tommy's importance and Lily's invisibility created a growing resentment within her. The more she tried to prove herself to her mother, the more she was dismissed. It was as if no matter what she did, she would never be enough to fill the space that Tommy occupied in Sarah's heart. Lily's sense of worth continued to diminish with each passing day. Her achievements went unnoticed, and her pain went unacknowledged. This emotional neglect was the foundation upon which Lily's eventual emotional withdrawal was built. Over time, she stopped seeking her mother's approval, stopped hoping for the love and attention that she once believed were her due. Instead, she learned to rely on herself, to build a sense of independence that would become crucial in the years to come. But the damage had been done. Lily would never again be the same innocent child who believed in the warmth of her family's love. The wedge between her and her mother had been driven so deep that it would take years, and perhaps a lifetime, to repair. Richard's arrival in their home marked the beginning of a new chapter for Lily, though it was far from the harmonious one he had hoped for. As a man with a gentle disposition and a kind heart, Richard took his role as a stepfather seriously. He could see the growing divide between Sarah and Lily, a divide that Sarah, blinded by her devotion to Tommy, refused to acknowledge. Richard, ever the observer, noticed how Lily seemed to retreat into herself, how her once bright eyes now reflected a deep sadness. He could see the longing in her face every time Sarah would lavish attention on Tommy, ignoring the quiet yearning Lily carried within her. Though Sarah was the mother, and he was the newcomer, Richard felt a responsibility to step in where he could, to try and make things better for Lily, to restore some semblance of balance to the fractured family. In the early days, Richard did what any decent man would do. He made an effort to include Lily in conversations, taking her to the movies, attending her school events, and even helping her with homework. It wasn't much, but it was something to show her that she wasn't invisible. Yet despite his efforts, there was a noticeable distance between them, a wall that Richard couldn't quite break down. He knew it wasn't just about spending time with Lily. It was about helping her feel valued, recognized for the person she was becoming. But Sarah's tunnel vision when it came to Tommy created a difficult obstacle. Whenever Richard would try to draw Lily into the family's emotional orbit, Sarah would subtly, almost imperceptibly, pull back. It was as though Sarah's focus on Tommy was all-consuming, and any attempt to direct attention toward Lily was met with resistance, even if it was cloaked in a false sense of kindness. Richard soon realized that Sarah wasn't just distant. She was overcompensating. Her overprotectiveness of Tommy was almost pathological, and it was clear to Richard that it was not just an expression of maternal love. It was a shield, a way to keep the world at bay and protect Tommy from the harshness of reality. Lily, on the other hand, seemed to have been left behind in the process, expected to understand the shift without being given any room to voice her feelings. Tommy was treated like a precious treasure, wrapped in layers of care and attention, while Lily was expected to fend for herself, as though she were already an adult. The tension between Richard's attempts to balance the family and Sarah's overprotectiveness of Tommy began to surface more often. Richard's patience, usually his strongest trait, began to wear thin. He could no longer ignore the fact that Tommy's behavior was not only unchallenged but rewarded, and that Lily's independence was increasingly stifled. He tried to reason with Sarah to bring some perspective to the situation, but his words often fell on deaf ears. It was as though Sarah couldn't or wouldn't see what was so obvious to Richard. Tommy needed to learn responsibility, and Lily needed to be nurtured, not neglected. But Sarah's devotion to Tommy had blinded her to this need. She couldn't see that by treating Tommy as though he were incapable of doing anything for himself, she was doing him a disservice. At the same time, by neglecting Lily's emotional needs, Sarah was creating a rift that would only continue to grow over time. One evening, the tensions reached a boiling point. Tommy, who was about 5 years old at the time, had once again left his toys scattered all over the living room, a common occurrence. Sarah, as usual, immediately shifted her attention to him, muttering something about his toys being too important to be put away. Richard, who had been quietly observing the situation from the other side of the room, had had enough. He knew that if things didn't change, Lily's sense of self-worth would only continue to deteriorate, and Tommy would grow up to be a man who expected the world to cater to his every need without ever lifting a finger. "Sarah, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah looked up, her brow furrowing. "About what?" "This," Richard gestured toward Tommy's mess. "You can't keep doing everything for him. He's old enough to start learning some responsibility. It's not healthy for him, and it's not healthy for the rest of us." Sarah's expression shifted immediately, hardening. What are you trying to say? That I'm a bad mother. Richard took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. No, of course not. But you're overcompensating for what happened. You're shielding Tommy from everything, even things that are important for his growth. He needs to learn how to clean up after himself, just like Lily does. Lily, who had been sitting at the table, pushing her food around on her plate, felt a pang of hurt in her chest. Her eyes flicked from her mother to Richard, her hands tightening around the fork in her grip. She wanted to speak up, to say something, but the words lodged themselves in her throat. For a moment everything seemed to stop, as though the entire house was holding its breath. But Sarah wasn't done. Lily's not my problem right now. Sarah snapped, her voice rising. Tommy is my responsibility and he needs me. He's just a child. Richard didn't flinch. He had heard this before, but he was not willing to give up. I understand that, but he's not going to be a child forever, Sarah. If we don't give him space to grow, to learn, we're only going to be setting him up for failure later on. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. I know what's best for him. You don't understand him like I do. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think I don't see how you treat Tommy like he's some kind of burden? You don't get it, Richard. You're not his father. The word stung more than Richard wanted to admit, but he didn't show it. He stood his ground, his gaze steady. I don't want to be his father, but I do want to be a good stepfather, and part of that is helping you see that Tommy needs more than just protection. He needs boundaries. He needs structure. He needs to feel like he's capable of doing things on his own. And Lily needs you too. She can't be expected to grow up unnoticed. Sarah's face hardened, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating. Eventually, Sarah muttered something under her breath and walked out of the room, leaving Richard standing there, feeling a quiet despair settle in his chest. His efforts to balance the family had only caused more strain. He knew that if Sarah didn't start seeing things differently, their family would never be whole again. Despite the tension, Richard didn't give up. He continued to try and support Lily, providing her with the guidance and attention that Sarah was so unwilling to give. He took her to her karate lessons, attended parent-teacher conferences, and spent evenings talking with her about her day. But the more he tried to bridge the gap, the more Sarah pushed back. Her defensiveness over Tommy, her reluctance to see the damage she was causing, prevented any meaningful change. Richard's words were always met with excuses or anger, and in the end, he realized that he could only do so much. He couldn't force Sarah to see the truth. Richard's attempts to balance the family and foster a healthier dynamic were constantly thwarted by Sarah's inability to let go of her overprotectiveness. His efforts were not wasted. He had managed to create a space for Lily to grow, and he had tried to advocate for Tommy's independence. But in the end, it was clear that the damage done by Sarah's neglect and overcompensation would take more than just one person's intervention to fix. As the years passed, Lily found herself increasingly determined to carve out a space for herself in a home that seemed to revolve entirely around Tommy. With the emotional neglect from her mother, Sarah, and the overwhelming focus on her younger brother, Lily sought solace in the one thing that felt within her control: her education and extracurricular activities. School became both a refuge and a challenge. She poured herself into her studies, determined to excel and prove that she was capable of something, anything, that would gain her the recognition she so desperately craved. Lily's passion for karate became her escape, the one place where she could feel valued and accomplished. From the first day she entered the dojo, she was hooked. It wasn't just about the discipline or the physical challenge, but about the sense of achievement she gained from each new belt she earned. Each time she broke through a personal barrier, whether it was executing a perfect roundhouse kick or learning a new kata, she felt a rush of pride, something that had been sorely missing from her home life. Unlike the household where her efforts often went unnoticed, the dojo was a place where her hard work paid off. Her karate instructors recognized her commitment, and her fellow students admired her determination. For once Lily felt seen. Richard, her stepfather, recognized the significance of Lily's efforts. He had been a steady presence in her life, the one person who tried to fill the gap left by her father's death. As Lily advanced in her karate training, Richard became her biggest supporter. He attended every class, clapping enthusiastically when she earned a new belt or demonstrated a new move with precision. His presence in the stands made Lily feel that, for once, someone was genuinely proud of her. This was the validation she had longed for, and Richard's unwavering encouragement provided her with a sense of stability that she had never found at home. Yet, despite Lily's growing success and the attention Richard gave her, there was always an undercurrent of frustration and sadness. She wanted to believe that her hard work would lead to something more. Something beyond the dojo, beyond the classroom. She hoped that her dedication would somehow force her mother to recognize her achievements, to see her as more than the invisible, neglected child she had become. But with every new milestone Lily reached, Sarah remained as distant as ever, her attention still fully consumed by Tommy's needs. While Lily worked tirelessly to build a future for herself, Tommy's behavior worsened, and his dependency on Sarah only grew. Where Lily was driven to succeed, Tommy seemed to do everything in his power to remain helpless. He had no interest in schoolwork, often failing to complete assignments or acting out in class. Instead of learning responsibility or independence, he demanded constant attention from Sarah, expecting her to do everything for him. If he needed help with something, whether it was a simple chore or something more involved like his schoolwork, he would look to Sarah for assistance, never once considering the possibility of doing things on his own. Sarah, for her part, indulged him, excusing his lack of effort as a phase or a result of his difficult circumstances. She could not, or would not see that her overprotectiveness was suffocating Tommy, preventing him from learning the essential life skills he needed to function as an adult. Lily, on the other hand, had learned early on that nothing came easily. She knew that her future would not be handed to her on a silver platter, and that if she wanted something, she would have to work tirelessly to get it. As Tommy's demands on Sarah increased, Lily's frustrations grew. It was as though her mother's ability to nurture Tommy had drained all the love and energy that might have been left for her. While Tommy spent his days playing video games or sulking in his room, Lily was out making strides toward her future. But no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, it never seemed to be enough to earn her mother's attention. One particular evening, after a long day of school and karate practice, Lily came home to find Tommy sprawled on the couch, a game controller in his hands, and Sarah sitting beside him as always, attending to his every need. Lily stood at the doorway, looking at them in silence for a moment. It was a scene she had seen countless times before, but something about it now struck her harder than usual. Tommy was getting older, but there he was, just as dependent as ever. Sarah's hands were full with Tommy's every need, from fetching him snacks to adjusting his blanket, while Lily, the one who had learned to manage her own responsibilities, stood on the sidelines, emotionally invisible. "Mom," Lily said quietly, trying to sound casual, "can I get some help with my math homework?" Sarah didn't even look up from her phone, her attention entirely on Tommy. "Not now, sweetie," she replied absently, her voice distracted. "I'll help you later, okay? Tommy needs me right now." The familiar sting of rejection hit Lily like a physical blow, and she quickly retreated to her room, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill. Her homework, which she had carefully prepared and planned for, felt insignificant in that moment. It was as if, in the face of Tommy's constant needs, her own were nothing more than an inconvenience. She had spent so much of her life trying to be independent, trying to prove that she could handle things on her own, but it never seemed to be enough. No matter how hard she tried, there was always the harsh reality of being overlooked in favor of Tommy's ongoing demands. It became harder for Lily to keep up the pretense that she didn't care. Every day she watched as Tommy, who had so little interest in anything beyond his own desires, was constantly catered to. Meanwhile, she worked herself to the bone, trying to prove that she was worthy of some kind of recognition. She wasn't asking for everything, just a little acknowledgement, a small gesture of care from the woman who was supposed to be her mother. But Sarah, consumed by Tommy's dependency, remained oblivious to the fact that Lily was slipping further away from her, emotionally and physically. The disparity between the two siblings continued to widen. Lily's success in karate and school contrasted sharply with Tommy's growing laziness and inability to take care of himself. Yet, while Lily found validation in her achievements, Tommy found nothing but excuses. Each time Sarah made a new excuse for Tommy's behavior, it felt like a slap in the face to Lily, who had worked so hard for everything she had. She could no longer hide the resentment that bubbled within her, nor could she continue pretending that everything was okay. Despite the lack of recognition from her mother, Lily refused to give up. She clung to the belief that one day her hard work would pay off. But with each passing day, she couldn't help but feel that the world she was working so hard to build was slipping through her fingers. The more she grew, the more she felt trapped in a family dynamic that never seemed to change. The struggle for independence was not just about achieving her goals. It was about finding a way to be seen, to be valued, to finally have a place in her own family. As Lily grew older, the weight of responsibility she carried seemed to only increase. She had always been determined to forge a path of independence, but the emotional and financial demands of her family continued to tug at her, forcing her to make sacrifices she never anticipated. Despite her growing successes in school and her karate training, Lily found herself increasingly sidelined as her mother, Sarah, continued to place Tommy at the center of her world. Tommy's behavior, which had only worsened over the years, seemed to go unchallenged, while Lily, despite her constant efforts, remained invisible. Sarah's unwavering devotion to her son left Lily feeling both unappreciated and neglected, caught in a cycle of sacrifice without any acknowledgement of her own needs. It began to feel like every step forward Lily took, whether in her studies, in her job, or in her extracurricular activities, was followed by 2 steps backward. As she worked hard to build a future for herself, Lily became increasingly aware of the strain her mother's dependence on her and Tommy's needs was placing on her. Sarah, who had always relied on Lily for emotional support, now also turned to her for financial help. The requests were subtle at first, small things like paying for groceries or helping with the bills when Sarah fell behind. Lily didn't hesitate to help, despite her own tight budget. After all, she understood the pressures her mother was facing, especially in light of Tommy's lack of ambition. However, as time wore on, Sarah's demands grew larger and more frequent, and Lily began to feel the immense weight of being the sole financial lifeline for her mother and her brother. There were days when Lily felt as though she were drowning under the pressure. Despite her growing resentment, she never once hesitated to give her mother the help she needed. When Sarah's car broke down, it was Lily who arranged for it to be repaired, dipping into her savings to cover the cost. When Tommy failed to meet the basic expectations of an adult, like finding a part-time job or even helping around the house, Lily would be the one to cover the costs, whether it was paying for Tommy's doctor's appointments or buying the things he insisted on having. All the while, her own dreams, her own financial goals, and even her well-being seemed to take a back seat. She was constantly stretching herself thin, doing everything she could to hold the family together, but there was no recognition or appreciation for her sacrifices. Lily's resentment toward her mother's behavior began to grow, but it was tempered by guilt. She had been taught, perhaps by society and certainly by her mother, that family came first, and that helping her loved ones was a noble and expected responsibility. But with each new sacrifice, Lily found herself slipping further into emotional exhaustion. She was living a life that was no longer her own, a life shaped by her mother's needs and Tommy's demands. She was spending her hard-earned money on a family that seemed to take her for granted, while her own goals and aspirations were pushed further and further away. Her dreams of buying a house, of investing in herself, of one day feeling financially stable, all of these were slipping through her fingers, swallowed by the demands of her family. There were times when Lily considered pulling away. The thought of canceling the automatic monthly payments she had been sending to her mother crossed her mind more than once. Yet, whenever she thought about it, the guilt would flood her. Her mother, who had lost so much and sacrificed so much for her family, depended on her. If Lily stopped helping, what would happen to them? Would Sarah lose everything? Would Tommy's lack of responsibility result in their undoing? These thoughts haunted Lily, and she could never quite bring herself to make the decision to stop the financial support. Instead, she continued to give, continued to pour herself into the role of caretaker, the one person who seemed to understand what her family needed. But even as Lily made these sacrifices, she could see that nothing was changing. Her mother's emotional neglect toward her continued, and Tommy's behavior only worsened. Tommy, now in his late teens, was still unable to take responsibility for anything. He still expected everything to be handed to him on a silver platter. Sarah, for her part, continued to excuse Tommy's behavior, reasoning that he was too sensitive or too special to deal with the real world. Sarah believed that Tommy's emotional fragility required her constant care and protection. It wasn't just that she neglected Lily. She actively enabled Tommy's behavior, excusing his laziness and his refusal to take responsibility for himself. Lily, despite everything, kept trying. She tried to be patient, to understand her mother's need to protect Tommy, but with every passing day, her patience wore thinner. She felt the growing disconnect between them, the widening gap between her mother's focus on Tommy and Lily's increasing frustration. Every time Sarah made excuses for Tommy's behavior, every time she chose to ignore Lily's needs, it felt like a betrayal. Lily's sacrifices, whether financial or emotional, were met with indifference. She was doing all the right things, working hard, helping out, trying to keep the peace, but it never seemed to be enough. One evening, after a long day of work and school, Lily came home to find Sarah sitting with Tommy. Both of them engaged in a conversation about Tommy's latest excuse for not applying for a job. "Mom, he needs to take responsibility for his own life," Lily said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "You can't keep doing everything for him." Sarah didn't even look up. "He's still so young, Lily," she replied absently, her gaze fixed on Tommy. "He needs me more than ever right now. You don't understand." The words stung and Lily fought back tears. It was the same conversation over and over again. Her mother never saw how much she had given, how much she had sacrificed for them. She never acknowledged that Lily too needed her support, her attention, her care. Lily had given so much of herself to her family, but in return, she was left feeling invisible, her efforts unrecognized. The weight of her sacrifices had begun to erode her sense of self-worth. She had done everything right, everything expected of her, but it was never enough. And as Tommy continued to rely on Sarah, and Sarah continued to favor him, Lily's emotional strain grew unbearable. She no longer knew how to keep going, how to reconcile her love for her family with the resentment that had built up over the years. The realization that she couldn't continue to live this way, that she couldn't keep sacrificing her happiness and success for people who didn't appreciate her, began to settle in. But it wasn't an easy realization. For years, Lily had convinced herself that she had to keep going, that she had to keep giving. But now she wondered, would it ever be enough? Would they ever see her for who she truly was beyond the role of the caretaker? Lily had always known that Richard was the steady anchor in her life, the one person who seemed to understand her needs and who believed in her potential. For years, he had been a quiet force of support, even in the face of her mother's overwhelming favoritism toward Tommy. Richard's encouragement was the only thing that had kept Lily going through the darkest times, when she felt invisible and emotionally exhausted. His kind words and unwavering belief in her abilities had been a balm for Lily's aching heart, the only source of solace in a household where she had long felt neglected. But when Richard passed away unexpectedly, everything shifted. It was sudden. One moment he was helping her with a new set of karate moves, and the next he was gone. His death, a massive heart attack, left Lily reeling. She couldn't fathom a life without him. Her mother's tearful, dramatic grief seemed to consume everything. Sarah once again turned inward, focusing entirely on her own sorrow and Tommy's ongoing needs. The funeral was a blur. Lily stood there, numb, watching her mother perform her grief for everyone else, playing the role of the broken widow. Tommy, predictably, was absent from the emotional turmoil. He barely seemed affected by Richard's death, more concerned about his own comfort than the man who had been a father figure to him. Lily's sense of abandonment grew in the wake of Richard's death. Without him, the family dynamic shifted, but not in the way she had hoped. Her mother Sarah had always relied on Richard to make the tough decisions, and to act as the moral compass in the household. Without him, Sarah's overwhelming attachment to Tommy grew, while Lily's emotional needs were entirely ignored. Tommy's behavior remained as it had always been: lazy, irresponsible, and dependent on others to carry him through life. Sarah, despite her deep grief over losing Richard, continued to pour every ounce of her attention into Tommy, excusing his actions and indulging him at every turn. In the wake of Richard's death, Lily's role in the family became clearer to her than ever before. She had always been the one to hold things together, to be the caretaker for both Sarah and Tommy. She had done so much for them, sacrificing her own happiness, her dreams, and even her financial security. For years, she had ignored the creeping sense of resentment that simmered beneath the surface, convincing herself that she was doing the right thing, that family came first. But now, without Richard's steady influence, the full weight of her sacrifices began to hit her. It wasn't just the emotional neglect. It wasn't just the constant financial burden. It was the realization that for all her giving, she had been emotionally manipulated and financially exploited by her mother and Tommy. Lily had spent so many years trying to be the perfect daughter, the one who made everything easier for Sarah and Tommy, but in the end her efforts had been taken for granted. She had been made to feel responsible for their well-being, their emotional states, and their financial stability. And every time she gave, every time she put their needs above her own, she had received nothing but more demands, more neglect, and more emotional distance. The final straw came one evening, shortly after Richard's death. Lily, now an adult, had secured a job at a consulting firm and was beginning to build a life for herself. Her career was taking off, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that she could finally achieve the independence and stability that had eluded her for so long. But when she visited home, she was confronted with the harsh reality of the situation. Sarah, who had never been the most financially responsible, was now relying heavily on Lily for support. Tommy, meanwhile, was still refusing to take any responsibility for his life. He spent his days lounging around, playing video games, and making excuses about why he couldn't find a job. Sarah, ever the enabler, defended him, citing his sensitivity and his need for support during this difficult time. Lily, now growing weary of the constant emotional manipulation, had been quietly funding the household, paying for Tommy's things, helping with bills, and covering Sarah's expenses whenever things got tight. But this time she felt the weight of it more than ever. She had worked hard to secure her own future, to build a career, and to finally get ahead. Yet here she was, still pouring money into a family that seemed to only take, without any regard for her own needs or well-being. "I'm sorry, Mom," Lily said one evening, her voice trembling with frustration. "I can't keep doing this anymore. I can't keep sending you money every month. I'm barely getting by myself." Sarah looked at her in shock. "What do you mean? You can't just stop helping us. Tommy needs you, and I'm not going to keep enabling you both," Lily interrupted, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been helping you for years. I've sacrificed my own happiness, my own goals to make sure you and Tommy are okay. And what have I gotten in return? Nothing. Nothing but more demands and more excuses. I can't keep living like this, Mom." Sarah's face twisted with hurt, but Lily could see the anger in her eyes. "How could you do this to us, Lily? After everything I've done for you?" Lily's chest tightened, but she didn't back down. "You've done nothing but expect me to sacrifice everything for you. And Tommy, he's never going to learn how to be responsible if you keep making excuses for him. You're not helping him, Mom. You're just enabling him." For the first time, Lily felt a sense of empowerment. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer bound by the guilt that had kept her trapped in this toxic cycle of giving. She had given everything she had, and it had never been enough. Now it was time to take control of her own life. The next morning, Lily made the decision that would change everything. She canceled the automatic transfers she had set up to her mother's account, the monthly payments that had drained her bank account and kept her financially tethered to a family that had never truly appreciated her. It was a difficult decision, one that filled her with guilt and anxiety, but deep down, she knew it was the right choice. She had to prioritize her own future for the first time in years. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She felt guilty about not being there for her mother and brother, but she also felt a sense of freedom that she had never experienced before. For the first time, she could focus on her own goals, on building her career, saving for a home, and living a life that was entirely her own. It wasn't easy and the guilt lingered, but Lily knew that if she didn't break free now, she would never have the chance to live the life she had always dreamed of. When her mother called to demand an explanation, Lily stood firm. She told Sarah that she could no longer support them financially, that she needed to focus on her own life and well-being. Sarah's reaction was predictable: angry, accusatory, and manipulative, but Lily didn't give in. She had made her decision, and for the first time she felt at peace with it. Richard's death had been a turning point for Lily, but it was also the catalyst for her own liberation. She realized that she had spent too many years living for others, and it was time to start living for herself. The final breaking point had come, and Lily was ready to move forward, free from the emotional and financial chains that had held her back for so long. Lily's decision to cut ties with her family was not a sudden one. It was the culmination of years of emotional neglect, financial strain, and deep-seated resentment. But even though the decision was difficult, it was the first time in a long while that Lily had felt a sense of clarity. When she canceled the automatic transfers to her mother's account, she felt an immediate rush of relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was the first step toward reclaiming her life, a life that had long been defined by the needs and expectations of others, rather than her own desires and aspirations. For so long, Lily had been trapped in a cycle of giving emotionally, financially, and mentally, while receiving little to nothing in return. Her efforts to appease her mother's demands, to support Tommy's lack of responsibility, and to maintain peace in a home that had never felt like home, had drained her. She had spent years sacrificing her happiness and her dreams, convincing herself that she was doing the right thing, that it was her duty to help her family. But when Richard passed away and Lily finally saw the full extent of the manipulation and exploitation she had been subjected to, it became clear that she could no longer continue down that path. It was time to put herself first. Lily didn't expect an easy road ahead. There were moments of guilt, moments when she questioned whether she had done the right thing. She knew that Sarah and Tommy would be upset, even angry with her decision. Sarah, in particular, had always relied on Lily, and Tommy's sense of entitlement would only deepen without Lily's financial contributions. But as the days passed, Lily began to realize that the guilt she felt was a product of years of conditioning. She had been taught to believe that she owed her family everything, but now she understood that her first responsibility was to herself. For once, she had to be the priority. Without the constant drain of financial obligations, Lily found herself with more room to breathe. She began to save money, something she had never been able to do before. Every paycheck, every savings deposit, was a reminder that she was building something for herself, a future that was no longer defined by the needs of her family. Lily wasn't just saving for a rainy day. She was saving for a life of her own, one that was filled with possibilities and freedom. For the first time, she could imagine a future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, worried about how much more she could give before it was too late. The next step in Lily's journey was buying a house. It had always been her dream to own her own home, a place where she could feel safe, grounded, and in control. But for years, that dream had felt impossible. With the constant pressure to provide for her family, Lily had never been able to save enough for a down payment. Now, with her finances no longer tied to her family's needs, she was able to focus on that goal. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of sacrifices to be made along the way. Lily lived frugally, cutting out unnecessary expenses, forgoing nights out and skipping vacations. Every dollar saved brought her one step closer to her dream. As she started looking at houses, Lily was filled with a sense of pride and excitement. The process of finding a place that felt like home was both overwhelming and exhilarating. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was creating a future she could be proud of. It was a future where she would no longer have to answer to anyone but herself. She could finally make decisions based on what was best for her, not what was best for the family she had spent so many years trying to fix. The house she eventually found wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It was a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far enough from her family's demands but close enough that she could visit if needed. As she walked through the empty rooms, imagining how she would fill them with her own things, she felt a sense of accomplishment. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the physical manifestation of her liberation. She was no longer shackled by guilt, by financial dependence, or by the toxic family dynamic that had ruled her life for so long. The house was a symbol of her independence, of the future she was finally building for herself. In the months that followed, Lily settled into her new life. She focused on her career with renewed energy, pouring herself into her work with a sense of purpose and determination that had been lacking before. Without the constant emotional drain of her family's problems, she was able to focus on her goals and her growth. She had long ago put aside the idea of being the perfect daughter, the one who took care of everything. Instead, she embraced the idea of being the best version of herself, someone who could thrive on her own, without constantly sacrificing her happiness for the sake of others. The guilt that had once weighed so heavily on her heart began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet pride in the life she was building. She had made the hard choice, the right choice, and for the first time in years she was at peace with it. It was a quiet victory, but it was hers. Lily had finally broken free from the chains that had held her captive for so long, and she was now free to live a life that was truly her own. While she had chosen to cut ties with her toxic family dynamic, Lily didn't abandon her family entirely. She still loved her mother, despite everything, and she still wanted the best for Tommy, even if he wasn't ready to take responsibility for his life. But for the first time, Lily understood that she could love them from a distance. She could be there for them, but she didn't have to carry the weight of their problems on her shoulders any longer. She had done everything she could for them, and now it was time to live for herself. As the months turned into years, Lily continued to thrive. She built a successful career, bought her own home, and found happiness in her independence. She had finally become the person she had always dreamed of being: strong, independent, and free from the emotional and financial burdens that had once defined her life. Lily hadn't expected to return home so soon. After months of building her new life, settling into her career, and nurturing her independence, she had grown comfortable with the distance she had put between herself and her family. Yet, when she received a call from her mother asking her to come home, something in Sarah's voice, something desperate and small, made Lily hesitate. She told herself it was a visit out of obligation, perhaps even a final chance to reconcile, to ease the guilt that had quietly lingered ever since she made the choice to cut the financial ties. But what awaited her would not be reconciliation, nor would it be a warm homecoming. It would be something much more painful, something that would solidify the emotional distance she had struggled to create for so long. When Lily arrived at the family home, it was immediately clear that things were not well. The house, which had once been filled with the laughter and chaos of daily life, felt quieter now, older, and more neglected. There were cracks in the walls, the paint was peeling, and the garden, once meticulously maintained by Richard, had become overgrown. As she stepped inside, a wave of discomfort washed over her. The place felt like a time capsule, holding all the memories of a family that had once been whole, but now seemed fractured beyond repair. Sarah, looking older than Lily remembered, greeted her with a forced smile, her eyes shadowed by the weight of her burdens. Tommy, as usual, was absent, locked away in his room, lost in his world of video games. As Sarah led Lily into the living room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. There was a tension that Lily couldn't quite place, something in the air that made her stomach churn. Sarah tried to make small talk, but it was clear that neither of them was truly present in the conversation. Lily sat down on the couch, her mind racing, wondering what her mother wanted. She had been avoiding these visits for so long. Yet here she was, back in the place that had once been home, and it didn't feel like home anymore. "Lily, there's something I need to talk to you about," Sarah finally said, her voice trembling slightly. She sat down across from Lily, her hands twisting in her lap. "I've been meaning to tell you for a while now." Lily braced herself. She had learned over the years that when her mother spoke with this tone, it usually meant that something uncomfortable, something painful was coming. "What is it, Mom?" Lily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah paused, her eyes flickering away for a moment before meeting Lily's gaze. "I've made some decisions about the future. About who will take care of things when I'm gone." There was a long pause as Sarah's gaze dropped to the floor. "I've signed everything over to Tommy. The house, the accounts, everything. It's all his now." Lily's heart sank, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean everything? You signed everything to Tommy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "I know it might seem unfair, but Tommy needs stability. He needs a foundation to build his life on, and he's been through so much, especially with Richard's passing. I can't ask him to start over. He's my son, Lily, and I've always thought I'd give him the life he deserves. You can't be serious," Lily interjected, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You're leaving everything to him? After everything he's done?" After all the years I've been the one to support you both, to hold this family together, and you're giving it all to him." Sarah looked away, her face hardening slightly. "It's not about you, Lily. It's about Tommy's future. He's still my baby, and I know you've done so much for us, but I can't ignore what he needs. He's always been the one who needed more attention, more care. You." Lily's eyes widened, her chest tightening with the weight of the words Sarah was saying. "You've always treated me like I don't matter," she said, her voice steady but filled with a deep pain. "You've always put Tommy first, and I've always had to be the one to sacrifice, to give. I've done everything for this family, Mom. Everything. And now you're telling me you never loved me the way you loved him." Sarah's face flushed, and for a moment Lily thought she saw a flicker of guilt. But then Sarah spoke, her voice cold and defensive. "That's not true. I love you, Lily, but Tommy needs me more. I've always loved him more because he's the one who's been fragile, the one who's needed more of my love. I never had the same connection with you. You were always so independent, always so strong. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed it." The words hit Lily like a physical blow. She had spent so much of her life trying to earn her mother's love, trying to prove that she was worthy of her attention. But now, as she sat there in that quiet room, she realized something she had never fully understood before. Her mother's love had always been conditional. It had always been tied to Tommy's needs, to his demands, and Lily had simply been an afterthought, expected to be strong enough to handle everything on her own. Lily stood up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I've spent my whole life trying to make you proud," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've sacrificed everything for you, and this is what I get in return? You've never truly seen me, Mom. Not really. You've always seen Tommy. And now you're making him your heir, your priority. You've signed me away without a second thought." Sarah didn't respond. She sat there, her eyes downcast, as though she couldn't bear to face the truth. But Lily had already made up her mind. She had spent years chasing after a love that wasn't hers to claim. She had spent years being the caretaker, the responsible one, the one who always gave, always sacrificed. And now she realized it was time to stop. "I'm done," Lily said quietly, her voice full of finality. "I can't keep doing this. I've tried for so long, but I can't keep putting myself last for you or for him. I'm walking away. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing myself." With that, Lily turned and walked out of the house, out of the life that had held her back for so long. She didn't look back, not even once. As she drove away, the weight that had clung to her for so many years finally lifted. For the first time in her life she felt free. As Lily drove away from the house that had once been her home, the weight of years of emotional burden seemed to lift with every mile. She felt lighter, as if the years of guilt, manipulation, and resentment had finally been released, and for the first time in her life, she could breathe freely. The emotional shackles that had bound her to a family that had never truly seen her were gone. Lily knew deep down that this moment marked the beginning of something entirely new, something she had never allowed herself to consider before: freedom. She had spent so many years being the one who held everything together, being the caretaker, the fixer. She had sacrificed her own happiness, her own dreams, and her own desires for a family that had never acknowledged her efforts. But now, as she embraced the open road ahead, she realized she was free from the obligations that had once defined her life. She was free to pursue her own happiness, to focus on her own growth, and to build a future that was entirely her own. Lily returned to her apartment, her sanctuary, where she had started anew. It was a small one-bedroom space, but it was hers. The freedom she had gained was palpable in every corner of the room. She had no one to answer to, no one to take care of but herself. For the first time in years, Lily felt a sense of control over her life. Her days were now filled with decisions that were hers and hers alone. There were no more late-night calls from her mother, no more requests for money or help with Tommy's problems. There was no longer the constant guilt that had once hovered over her every decision. She was no longer bound by the expectations of others. With the weight of her past life finally behind her, Lily turned her attention to her career. She had worked tirelessly to build a successful professional life, and now with the mental space to focus entirely on her work, she began to flourish in ways she had never anticipated. She took on more projects at her consulting firm, diving into each new challenge with enthusiasm and a renewed sense of purpose. Her colleagues began to notice the difference in her energy. Her drive had always been there, but now it was backed by a sense of confidence and determination that she had never allowed herself to feel before. Lily was no longer holding herself back for the sake of others. She was thriving because she finally understood that her success was hers to claim. The days became a blur of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and career advancements. Lily felt herself growing in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer just the daughter who had to clean up after her family, or the one who put everyone else's needs first. She was a professional in her own right, making her mark in a field that she was passionate about. It was a beautiful realization to have. She had worked so hard for this, and now she was reaping the benefits. But more than that, it was a reminder that she was in control of her own destiny. As Lily's professional life began to thrive, she also began to focus on her personal growth. She had spent so many years putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own that she had lost sight of who she truly was. Now she could finally reconnect with the parts of herself that had been buried under years of sacrifice. She started to explore her hobbies again, things she had put aside in favor of helping her family. She began to read more, take long walks in the park, and reconnect with friends she had lost touch with. Lily realized that her personal identity had been neglected for far too long. It was time to rediscover who she was outside of her role as caretaker, and she welcomed the process with open arms. One of the most liberating changes Lily experienced was the sense of inner peace that came with her newfound independence. She no longer felt like she was constantly chasing approval or validation from her family. The guilt that had plagued her for years began to dissolve. She was no longer weighed down by the expectation that she had to give everything for the sake of others. Instead, she was free to live a life that was authentic to her, one where her own desires and aspirations came first. For the first time, Lily felt as if she could finally exhale. There were still moments of doubt, of course. She would occasionally receive messages from her mother or Tommy, but they no longer had the same hold on her. The guilt that used to compel her to respond, to give in to their demands, was gone. She had learned that taking care of herself was not selfish, it was necessary. She had learned that true love and care for others could only come from a place of self-respect and self-love. Lily had spent years trying to be everything for everyone, and in the process she had lost herself. Now she was reclaiming who she was and what she deserved. As time passed, Lily continued to focus on her own future. She saved diligently for a down payment on a house, something she had dreamed of for so long, but had never been able to achieve due to her financial obligations to her family. Now, with the money she was able to save, she was on her way to buying a place of her own, a home that would be a reflection of her hard work and independence. For the first time, she could envision a life that was built solely for her. It wasn't just about the house itself, it was about what it represented. It was her symbol of freedom, of taking control of her future. Lily's journey wasn't without its challenges, but it was also filled with triumphs. She had learned how to set boundaries, how to prioritize her own needs, and how to live a life that was fulfilling on her own terms. The weight of her past had finally been lifted, and she stood tall, knowing that she was in charge of her own destiny. She had let go of the guilt and the emotional burdens of her past, and in doing so she had found the freedom she had always craved. For the first time in her life, Lily was living authentically, no longer sacrificing herself for others, no longer hiding in the shadows of her family's needs. She was free to grow, to achieve, and to live a life that was truly hers. She had embraced her newfound independence, and with it she had begun a new chapter, one where she was the author of her own story. Lily had come a long way from the days when her life had been shaped by her mother's emotional needs and Tommy's constant demands. After years of emotional turmoil, financial strain, and feeling invisible, she had finally severed the toxic ties that had kept her bound to a life of caretaking. Her decision to cut ties with her family had not been easy, but it was the turning point that opened the door to a life of true freedom. She had chosen herself, a choice that allowed her to breathe for the first time in years. Lily found herself waking up every morning with a sense of peace she had never known before. Gone were the days of dreading phone calls from her mother, or the constant guilt about Tommy's failures. For the first time, Lily could pursue her own happiness without feeling responsible for fixing her family's problems. Her career blossomed as she embraced opportunities to grow and prove her worth. At work, Lily was respected. She had proven herself time and again, leading projects, presenting innovative ideas, and building relationships with clients. The recognition she received from her colleagues and superiors only bolstered her confidence. Lily knew she was capable, not only because she had the skill set but because she had been forced to become strong in ways most people never had to. The personal growth that came with this newfound freedom was equally fulfilling. With her emotional and financial burdens lifted, Lily was able to focus on things she had put aside for too long: friendships, hobbies, and, for the first time in a long while, her own mental and physical well-being. She joined a yoga class, something she had always wanted to try but had never had time for. She reconnected with old friends she hadn't seen in years, and even began dating again, a process that felt both exhilarating and terrifying after years of emotional distance. Lily found happiness in the little things. Enjoying a quiet Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, taking weekend trips to explore new places, and spending time with people who cared about her for who she was, not for what she could give them. Her life was becoming her own, a life she had carved out for herself after so many years of living for others. In contrast, Tommy remained unchanged. Despite all of Lily's efforts to help him, years of lending money, offering advice, and even trying to force him to take responsibility, he was still the same entitled, lazy person he had always been. Lily had tried, but the truth was clear. Tommy simply did not want to change. Lily had always seen potential in her brother, even when no one else did. She believed that deep down he could turn his life around if he just applied himself. But Tommy had no interest in working hard or taking responsibility. He lived in a world where others, particularly Sarah, were expected to take care of him. He did not believe in working for what he wanted. If there was a problem, Tommy expected someone else to fix it for him. The reality of Tommy's behavior hit Lily hard after she had distanced herself from him. She had spent years trying to fix him, trying to get him to grow up and take responsibility for his life. She had lent him money, tried to encourage him to find a job, and even offered to help him set up a budget. But Tommy's reaction had always been the same. He shrugged her off, making excuses, and insisting that he didn't need to do any of it. When Sarah called to tell Lily about Tommy's latest escapade, getting fired from yet another job because he couldn't be bothered to show up on time, Lily felt a sharp pang of frustration mixed with sorrow. She realized then that no matter how much she wanted to help, no matter how much she tried, Tommy would not change unless he wanted to. And at that moment it was clear he didn't. "Lily, I don't know what to do." Sarah's voice cracked over the phone, her tone filled with worry. "Tommy's just lost. He won't listen to me anymore. He's so angry and I don't know how to reach him." Lily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She knew her mother's despair. Sarah had always coddled Tommy, always made excuses for his bad behavior, and now it was coming to a head. She had been protecting him for years, shielding him from the consequences of his actions, and it had only made things worse. "I'm sorry, Mom," Lily said softly, "but I can't keep doing this for him. He has to face the consequences of his actions. I can't keep bailing him out." "But he's my son," Sarah protested, her voice shaking with emotion. "How can I just let him fall apart like this?" Lily's heart ached for her mother, but she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. "You've been doing it for years, Mom. You've been keeping him from learning how to live on his own. It's not helping him. He's not going to change unless he wants to. I can't fix him. I can't keep saving him." The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy. Lily could almost hear Sarah struggling with the reality of her words. But it was the truth. Lily knew it, and deep down Sarah did too. Tommy needed to take responsibility for his life, and neither Lily nor Sarah could do it for him. As the weeks passed, Tommy's behavior only seemed to worsen. He continued to refuse work, mooch off Sarah, and act entitled to everything that was given to him. His relationships with friends and family became strained, as he refused to take accountability for his actions and made excuses for his lack of ambition. Despite Lily's distance, she still heard snippets of updates from Sarah about Tommy's latest failures, but she had made peace with the fact that there was nothing more she could do. Then came the news that would change everything. Tommy had been arrested for stealing from a local store. The details were murky at first, but the crime was serious enough to land him in jail. Sarah, understandably, was devastated. But her reaction wasn't just about the crime. It was about her son's utter disregard for responsibility. She couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad. And she couldn't believe Tommy had crossed the line into criminal behavior. "Lily, I don't know what to do," Sarah said over the phone, her voice strained with panic. "Tommy, he's in jail. They say he assaulted someone. How did we get here?" Lily's heart sank. She knew this day was coming, but hearing the word still sent a shock through her. She had hoped that Tommy would hit rock bottom and finally realize that his actions had consequences. But she never imagined it would escalate this far. "Mom," Lily said gently but firmly, "this is the reality of enabling him for so long. You've protected him from everything, and now he's facing the consequences. I'm so sorry this is happening, but we both know this was inevitable." Sarah's sobs echoed through the phone. "I don't know how to fix him. I failed him." Lily took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "You haven't failed him, Mom, but you can't keep protecting him. He has to face the consequences of what he's done. You can't keep carrying him." The weight of Sarah's guilt was palpable. She had spent so long shielding Tommy from reality, from the lessons he needed to learn, that it was now too late to undo the damage. Tommy was now facing a harsh reality that neither he nor Sarah had ever been prepared for. For Lily, the situation was heartbreaking, but it also reaffirmed her decision to focus on her own life. She had tried to help Tommy for years, but now she realized that the best thing she could do for herself and for her family was to let go. She couldn't fix Tommy, and no amount of guilt or obligation would change that. Lily found peace in the knowledge that she had made the right choice for herself. She had prioritized her happiness, her well-being, and her future. And while the pain of seeing her family fall apart still stung, she knew it was time to stop sacrificing herself for others. As Sarah grappled with the fallout from Tommy's arrest, Lily focused on continuing to build her life, one that was free from the weight of her family's dysfunction. She knew that Tommy's path was his own to walk, and she could no longer carry him. Lily's newfound happiness was the result of years of self-sacrifice, but now, for the first time, she was living for herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to navigate. And with each passing day, she grew stronger, knowing that she had finally chosen the life she deserved. For years, Tommy had been living in a haze of entitlement and laziness. Despite Lily's best efforts to help him, and despite the sacrifices their mother, Sarah, had made for him, Tommy had never truly embraced responsibility. He had been given everything he needed to succeed, yet he refused to do anything for himself. Instead, he coasted through life, constantly expecting others to clean up his messes, fix his mistakes, and bear the weight of his failures. His dependency on Sarah had become his crutch, and the resentment that brewed inside him only seemed to fuel his sense of entitlement. Sarah had always been there for him, protecting him from the consequences of his actions, giving him second and third chances, and never pushing him to take responsibility. As the years passed, Tommy's behavior grew more erratic, and his laziness more pronounced. He refused to get a job, ignored his responsibilities, and consistently found ways to avoid growing up. To Sarah, he was still her little boy, and no matter what he did, she was convinced that it was just a phase he would grow out of. But that day, something in Tommy snapped. Whether it was the growing sense of resentment toward his family, the weight of his own failures, or simply the realization that he had nothing left, Tommy made a choice that would change everything. With a sense of entitlement burning inside him, he decided to take what he wanted, regardless of the cost. And so he walked into a local convenience store, desperate for anything, that could give him the feeling of control he had been lacking. Tommy walked through the aisles of the store, his eyes scanning the shelves, taking note of the items that caught his attention. Without thinking, he grabbed a few bottles of expensive liquor and slipped them into his jacket. He was ready to walk out the door, believing that, like always, he could get away with it. But this time it was different. The store clerk, a young man barely older than Tommy, noticed the suspicious behavior and stepped forward to confront him. The moment the clerk asked Tommy to stop and pay for the items, Tommy's mind went into a frenzy. He felt cornered, embarrassed, and furious. In a split second, he lashed out. The store clerk grabbed his arm to stop him from leaving, and in a panic, Tommy shoved the clerk aside, knocking him to the ground. Without thinking, he fled the scene, the weight of his actions lost on him. The police arrived soon after, responding to the clerk's call. Tommy had left the store, but the evidence was all over the surveillance cameras. The footage clearly showed him not only stealing the liquor but also assaulting the clerk. It was a crime that could not be ignored, and Tommy, for the first time, realized that his behavior had consequences that could no longer be avoided. The news of Tommy's arrest hit Sarah like a freight train. She had spent her entire life protecting him, making excuses for him, and doing everything in her power to shield him from the harsh realities of life. But now her son had committed a crime. Not only had he stolen, but he had also assaulted someone in the process. Sarah's mind was spinning, and she could hardly believe what was happening. This wasn't the son she had raised. How had it come to this? Sarah's hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, dialing the number of the police station. She needed to hear it from them. She needed to know that it wasn't a mistake, that Tommy wasn't being falsely accused. "Hello, this is Detective Harris. How can I help you?" came the voice on the other end of the line. I'm calling about my son," Sarah stammered, her voice cracking. "Tommy Armstrong. He was arrested today. Can you tell me what happened? Why is he in jail?" Detective Harris's tone was sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, your son is facing charges of theft and assault." The store clerk reported the incident, and there is surveillance footage of him stealing and pushing the clerk when confronted. Tommy's been arrested, and he's currently being held at the station. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Tommy, her baby boy, had never been in trouble before. How could this happen? Why hadn't she seen it coming? The truth was painful, like a slap in the face. Tommy's choices had finally caught up with him, and Sarah's enabling behavior had played a large part in it. She had protected him from every consequence, given him endless chances, and refused to accept that he was an adult who needed to take responsibility for his actions. The detective continued, "We'll need you to come down to the station and speak with your son. We can discuss the next steps from there." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had no idea how to process what had just happened. All she could think of was how she had failed Tommy. How had she allowed him to get to this point? The guilt washed over her in waves, drowning her in the realization that she had been too soft, too indulgent. She had made every excuse for Tommy's behavior, thinking that if she gave him more time, more chances, he would finally change. But it wasn't working, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived at the police station, her heart heavy with dread. She had never imagined a moment like this would come. She had always believed deep down that Tommy would eventually turn his life around, that he would wake up one day and realize the importance of responsibility. But this was the harsh reality. Tommy was in jail, facing serious charges, and Sarah couldn't shield him this time. Tommy sat in the holding cell, his head down, his hands shackled to the chair. He was angry and frustrated, but underneath it all there was a deep sense of fear. This was real. This wasn't a mistake he could talk his way out of. The weight of his actions had finally caught up to him, and for the first time in his life, Tommy realized that he couldn't escape the consequences. When Sarah walked into the room, her face pale and tear-streaked, Tommy looked up. The look in her eyes, the disappointment, the sadness, pierced him like a knife. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to say. "Tommy," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "How could you do this? How could you betray me like this?" Tommy remained silent. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to blame everyone else for his mistakes. But the words wouldn't come. For once in his life, Tommy didn't have an excuse. He had pushed too far, and now he was paying the price. "I didn't raise you like this," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I gave you everything. Everything, Tommy. And this is what you do. This is what you've become." Tommy looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He felt ashamed, but there was also a part of him that didn't care. He had lived his life expecting everyone else to fix things for him, and now that it had all crumbled, he didn't know how to handle it. This wasn't the life he had imagined. He hadn't planned for it to come to this. The reality was sinking in. His actions had consequences, and there was no one left to blame but himself. The drive home from the police station was agonizing. Sarah could hardly keep her eyes on the road, the weight of the guilt crushing her chest. Her thoughts were a blur, and her mind kept circling back to the same question. How had she allowed Tommy to get to this point? She had spent so many years protecting him, making excuses for his behavior, and refusing to let him face the consequences. And now here they were. Tommy was in jail, and Sarah couldn't help but feel responsible. When she arrived home, she found herself sitting in the living room, staring at the walls that had once felt like a safe haven. This was her home, the place where she had raised her children, the place where she had poured all her love and care. But now it felt like a prison. She had failed her son. She had allowed him to become someone who thought he could get away with anything, someone who had no regard for the consequences of his actions. Lily's words echoed in Sarah's mind. You can't keep carrying him. She realized Lily was right. She had been enabling Tommy for years, protecting him from the harsh realities of life, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The road ahead was uncertain. Tommy's future was no longer in her hands. He would have to face the consequences of his choices, and so would she. For the first time in a long time, Sarah understood that the only way to move forward was to accept that she could no longer protect her children from the consequences of their actions. She had spent years trying to shield them, but now it was time to face reality. She had to let go not just of Tommy, but of the past that had held her captive. And in that moment Sarah made a decision. It was time to change. She couldn't fix Tommy, but she could start by fixing herself. She had to stop enabling his behavior, stop protecting him from the world, and start living for herself. It was the only way she could move forward. And it was the only way Tommy would ever have a chance to change. Lily sat on the balcony of her small, cozy apartment, the soft hum of the city below her. She felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The chaos of her family, her mother's constant need for her, her brother's reckless behavior, and the emotional drain they had always put on her, was no longer part of her daily life. Yet, as she sat there with a cup of tea in her hands, she couldn't help but reflect on the events that had brought her to this place. Her brother Tommy had always been a source of tension, but his actions had escalated to the point where she could no longer deny the damage he had caused. She had spent so many years trying to save him, to fix him, but now she realized she had to let go. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Tommy's still in jail, and I just don't know what to do anymore. I can't believe this is happening. Lily sighed, knowing this message was only one of many that would follow. Sarah was devastated, but Lily couldn't be the one to carry that burden anymore. She had tried for years, helping, comforting, giving everything she had. But it was never enough, and Tommy's choices had brought them to this breaking point. She had told her mother time and time again that Tommy needed to face the consequences of his actions, that he would never change as long as Sarah continued to protect him. And now, Sarah was forced to see the reality that had been so clear to Lily for so long. Tommy's arrest was a wake-up call for both of them, but it was one that Lily had already faced long ago. She had made the painful decision to set boundaries and prioritize her own happiness. And now, with that decision firmly in place, she couldn't allow herself to go back to the old dynamic. Lily stared out at the city, taking in the skyline that symbolized the freedom she had fought so hard to gain. Her journey toward independence hadn't been easy. It had taken years of sacrifice, self-reflection, and difficult decisions. She had distanced herself from her family, from the toxic patterns that had shaped her childhood, and from the constant demands that had drained her. She had chosen herself. And that choice, though painful at times, had given her the life she had always wanted. A life where she could breathe, where she could grow, and where she could finally be happy without the weight of guilt hanging over her head. Tommy's crime had forced her to confront the inevitable truth. She could not continue to fix the mess that others had created. She could no longer carry the burdens of her family's dysfunction. The phone rang again, and Lily hesitated before answering. It was Sarah. Lily, I just don't know what to do anymore. I'm so lost. Tommy's in jail, and I've failed him as a mother. I should have done more. Why didn't I see this coming? Sarah's voice trembled with guilt, regret, and exhaustion. Lily knew this was the moment she had been dreading. The moment when her mother would finally acknowledge the consequences of her enabling behavior. Mom, Lily began, her voice calm but firm. You've been enabling him for years. You've been protecting him from every consequence, making excuses for him, and giving him everything he's ever wanted. But it hasn't helped him, Mom. It's only made him worse. This isn't your fault, but it's time to stop trying to fix him. You can't keep doing this. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Lily could hear Sarah's soft sobs, the realization of what Lily had said settling in. I know, Lily. I know. I've been so blinded by my love for him. I didn't see that I was suffocating him. I didn't see that by protecting him, I was enabling his bad choices. Lily's heart ached for her mother. She knew that this moment, the moment when Sarah finally acknowledged her role in Tommy's downfall, was both painful and necessary. You've been a great mother to me, Mom. But you've got to start being a mother to yourself too. You've spent so much time trying to fix everything for Tommy that you've neglected your own needs. And it's time to stop. Sarah's sobs grew quieter, and after a long pause she spoke softly. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to stop loving him and trying to protect him. But I see now that I've been hurting him all along. It's not too late, Mom, Lily replied, her voice softening. But you have to let him face the consequences of his actions. You have to let him grow up. You can't fix him. You can only fix yourself. As the conversation ended, Lily felt a sense of clarity. She had done what she could for her family. She had tried for years to help them, to fix them, but it was no longer her responsibility. Her path forward was clear. She would continue to live her life for herself, no longer burdened by the past or by the toxic relationships that had once defined her. For Sarah, the reality of her enabling behavior hit hard. Tommy's arrest had shaken her to her core. She had always believed that her role as a mother was to protect and nurture her children, but in doing so, she had smothered Tommy's growth. She had shielded him from the consequences of his actions, allowing him to drift through life without ever having to take responsibility for anything. And now, her son was in jail, facing the consequences of his choices in a way that neither she nor Tommy had ever imagined. Sarah sat in her living room, staring at the framed photo of Tommy on the wall, the same photo she had hung there years ago when he was just a boy. She had always seen him as her baby, the one who needed her care and protection. But now, looking at that photo, she saw something different. She saw a young man who had never been taught how to stand on his own 2 feet, who had never learned to take responsibility for his actions. She saw a son who had been allowed to live in a world of excuses, where everything was handed to him without effort or consequence. Her mind replayed the years of decisions she had made, decisions that had been motivated by love, yes, but also by fear. She had been afraid to let Tommy go, afraid that if she didn't protect him, he would fail. She had been afraid of what would happen if she didn't take care of everything for him. And in her fear, she had failed him in the most profound way. For the first time, Sarah began to see the damage her overprotectiveness had caused. She had spent so much of her energy making excuses for Tommy, covering up his mistakes, and sheltering him from the real world, that she had failed to prepare him for the challenges he would face as an adult. Now, as she sat alone in her home, the weight of her own role in Tommy's downfall was crushing. She had to accept the painful truth. She had enabled him, and now she had to face the consequences of that. Her mind drifted back to Lily's words. You can't keep fixing him, Mom. You've been fixing everything for him for so long, but it hasn't helped him. You need to fix yourself. Sarah realized that Lily was right. She had been living her life through her children, pouring all of her energy into taking care of them at the expense of her own well-being. She had lost herself in the process. And now, with Tommy in jail and her own life in shambles, Sarah knew she had to start over. It was time to change, not just for Tommy but for herself. Sarah couldn't undo the past, but she could take responsibility for her future. She needed to learn how to let go, how to stop protecting Tommy from the consequences of his actions, and how to start living for herself. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be many moments of doubt and fear. But Sarah was determined to reclaim her life, to stop being defined by her role as a mother to Tommy, and to learn how to be a mother to herself. As the days passed, Sarah began the painful process of reassessing her life. She started by setting small boundaries, refusing to give Tommy money when he asked for it, not rushing to his aid every time he got into trouble. She began to focus on her own needs, taking up hobbies she had long neglected and spending time with friends who reminded her of who she used to be. It was a slow and difficult process, but she could feel the shift happening. For the first time in years, she was thinking about herself, not just her children. As for Tommy, his path was unclear. His arrest had been a wake-up call, but it remained to be seen whether he would take responsibility for his actions or continue to spiral downward. The future of their relationship was uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. She couldn't fix him anymore. She had to let him go, and in doing so, she was beginning to reclaim her own life. And Lily, from afar, watched her mother's journey with a mixture of sadness and hope. She had done what she could, had fought for her own happiness, and had set boundaries that allowed her to live a life of peace. Now it was Sarah's turn to find her own path, free from the guilt and the weight of Tommy's dependency. For both of them, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road they would walk as individuals, no longer bound by the toxic patterns of the past.